Hey everyone, welcome back to Storytime with Alex. There have been some changes and I have 3 things to tell you. Thing 1, I just washed my hair, so if you get distracted by it drying and slowly getting bigger and fluffier, I apologise. Thing 2, we've had to put a temporary stop on the Blackwell's Facebook page, so this is now just going out on my Facebook page, which means I can do what I damn well please. Enjoy. And thing 3, I had used this book and recorded me reading the entirety of John Polidori's The Vampire, and then something went wrong with my new memory chip and it all got wiped, and so I thought maybe people don't, it's a sign from God that people don't necessarily want to listen to classic Gothic tales, and maybe another sign from God is that Mary Stonell yesterday sent me Supernatural Night Terror. So for maybe like the next month I'm going to do a chapter a day of Supernatural Night Terror by John Passarella. Maybe go buy it. I don't know. John, if you see this, please don't sue me. I'm just trying to drive your royalties up. But yeah, I don't think it's important if you've seen Supernatural. I haven't read this book, but we'll get through it together. There is a historian's note at the beginning. This novel takes place during season 6 between Frontierland and Mummy Dearest. I mean, I've seen that and I can't remember what happened then. We'll be fine. Anyway, so sit back, relax, and let's begin with the prologue. Gavin Shelley Shelburne ambled along the tree-lined streets of downtown Clayton Falls, Colorado, with enough conviction to avoid any charges of loitering. Occasionally he sat on one of the secured wrought-iron benches to rest his perpetually sore feet, which had worn down the soles of his scuffed boots to the intimation of rice paper. Mostly he spent the evening hours circling the restaurant district, 8 square blocks encompassing the most popular sit-down restaurants, asking for handouts. Whether people were about to sit down to a good meal or returning to their cars after enjoying a fine repast, his strategy was to impart a touch of guilt on these more fortunate citizens. With a notoriously bad economy struggling to right itself, Shelburne remained on the bottom looking up. Not that it was much consolation to a man who had lost his wife to a lengthy illness, his job to subsequent neglect in unforgiving times, and his house to dispassionate bankers. But his current disenfranchised condition lacked the stigma of years past. With record unemployment and housing foreclosures, "There but for the grace of God go I" had become a familiar refrain. It's maybe too close to the bone. The decline and fall of Gavin Shelburne had begun in advance of the so-called Great Recession, but he wasn't above accepting the sympathy of those still gainfully employed to keep his stomach, if not full, then at least occasionally mindful of its gastric function. To that end he made his nightly rounds, wearing a battered fedora, which he unfailingly tipped to the ladies and regularly flipped over to accommodate folded donations, along with a rumpled overcoat that also served as his blanket and fell to the top of his second-hand combat boots. His gaunt torso gained some bulk from the 2 button-down shirts he wore, one over the other, though he switched the layers each day in lieu of regular laundering. Combined, the 2 shirts had a complement of buttons sufficient for one. His threadbare jeans retained a hint of their original black colour. On most nights, the reliable combination of sympathy, guilt, and polite panhandling kept Shelley's stomach fed and, yes, his spirits warm, while steering clear of Chief Quinn's holding cell. But the lingering effects of a poor economy led to slow evenings in the restaurant district, especially on weeknights. He reached the outskirts of his bread-and-butter zone, near the smaller pizza joints, which offered slim pickings at the best of times, and was about to head back when a middle-aged woman rushed out of Joe's Pizza Shack with a large pizza box and a 2-litre bottle of Coke. "Good evening, madam," he said, tipping his multi-purpose fedora. "Oh," she said, startled, pausing in her dash to her car, a white Nissan idling at an unfed parking meter. "All right." She set the pizza box on the hood of the car, fished a crumpled dollar bill out of her purse, and dropped it in his hat. "Here you go." "Thank you, madam," he said. I'm not going to do accents, I just do apologise. graciously accepting the $1, which he stuffed into his left pocket since the right had a hole that had travelled the entire length of the seam. With a careless wave, she gathered up her pizza box, jumped in the car, and sped off. A fine white mist roiled in her wake, seeming to seep in from the side streets and roll past him, lending an unearthly quality to the gritty areas that lay beyond the reach of the urban gentrification of the downtown district. More than isolated, he felt abandoned, as if reality, along with the suburban woman, had decided to move on without him. He stood for a moment, staring after her car, before pushing the fedora back down over his thinning, prematurely grey hair, and turned back the way he had come. Despite momentary delusions to the contrary, his reality had not changed. Though it had become routine, his life remained unpleasant, with no guarantees. But these days, he thought, nobody has any guarantees. Over the course of the slow evening, he'd collected enough to pay for a few slices of pizza and a beverage to call his own, but it was too soon to reward himself with a meal or a drink, alcoholic or otherwise. Within the next hour, the last wave of sated diners would be heading home to park themselves in front of their high-definition plasma screens. Surely a few would spare $1 or $2 for a neighbour who had fallen on hard times. Ignoring a protracted grumble of protest from his stomach, he continued his trek back towards the heart of the restaurant district. He hadn't gotten far when he heard another sound behind him, a scrape like steel on concrete, followed by a sudden slurping hiss. Startled, he whirled around and staggered backwards in disbelief. "What the hell?" he whispered. It wasn't possible. His right hand patted the flask tucked into his overcoat pocket. Almost full. He hadn't touched the stuff, was saving it for later, when he would hunker down for another fitful night's sleep. But even if he had droned every drop, it couldn't explain what he saw. It was easily as long as 2 Nissans. A giant lizard with a black pebbled face, its long, powerful body and massive tail banded with bright orange. A name bubbled up from his subconscious, planted there in his grade school years and not quite forgotten. Gila monster. Its forked tongue, long as a pink yardstick, flickered out towards him, tasting the air. Then its jaws spread open, revealing a row of sharp teeth lining a mouth that could accommodate his head and entire torso in a single bite. He remembered something else about Gila monsters. They released venom in their saliva, a nasty neurotoxin that would paralyze their prey. Sweet Jesus. Unable to tear his gaze away from the monstrous lizard, Shelley stumbled back several paces. These creatures were supposed to be slow, but they were also supposed to be less than 2 feet long. This one was 20 times that size. It took a step towards him, one set of sharp claws scraping the pavement beneath it. The tongue flicked out again. Then all 4 legs began to churn forward in an alternating stride that covered ground much too quickly for Shelley's liking. Turning his back on the enormous creature, he ran almost doubled over, out of control. Behind him, the raking claws struck the concrete in a frightening, metronomic rhythm that gained in volume as the distance between him and the creature withered away. "Help! Somebody help me!" he screamed breathlessly. His voice seemed lost in the night, silenced by the blanket of mist and his total isolation. Never had he felt more alone on the streets of Clayton Falls than at that moment. Gasping in a breath to scream again, he felt the monster's long, forked tongue, sticky with what he imagined a lethal dose of venom, strafe his stubble-covered cheek. He squealed in uncontrolled fright, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst in his chest like a blood-filled grenade. Claws slapped down on his right heel, and the combat boot was wrenched off his foot, twisting his ankle painfully to the side. Staggering, he barely managed to maintain his balance, but knew his time had run out. So he veered left, into an alley behind a Chinese restaurant. The hot breath of the giant Gila monster washed over the back of his neck. Shelley heard a loud thump as the creature's enormous tail struck a parking meter. I was going to say there are quite a lot of grammatical and spelling errors already. The alley ran all the way through to Bell Street, but he couldn't outrun the creature here either. In seconds he would be devoured, close to where he often scavenged for discarded food himself, right out of the... He veered to the left, raised his left arm up to the edge of the shadowy bulk of the restaurant's dumpster, and heaved himself over the lip and down into the damp and malodorous refuse. No sooner had he landed in the cushion of garbage than something, probably the Gila monster's head, struck the side of the dumpster and propelled it down the alley. Metal shrieked against the brick wall opposite the rear of the Chinese restaurant. The dumpster trundled spastically as its undersized wheels squealed in protest. Abruptly, the jittery motion stopped. Shelley held his breath. All he heard was the thunderous beating of his overtaxed heart. As he pushed himself up to a sitting position, something powerful struck the side of the dumpster, dimpling the steel right between his feet and rocking the container back into the brick wall. Another protracted screech as this creature's claws raked the exterior. Shelley remembered another unfortunate fact about Gila monsters. They could climb. And this one was large enough to raise itself over the edge of the dumpster. He was cornered. Frantically, he swept his hands through the slimy and sticky refuse, searching for something sharp or hard, anything that could serve as a weapon. His search became more desperate when he saw the creature's claws wrap around the rim of the dumpster like a matching set of butcher knives. The trash bin began to tilt forward as the creature's weight pressed down on it. Shelley heard an explosive pop as one of the wheels sheared off the base. It was only a matter of seconds before the pebbled head, beady black eyes, and grotesquely long forked tongue would rise over him and block out the sky. Shelley's foraging hand slammed into a wooden slat. He blindly traced its dimensions because he refused to look away from the dumpster's opening. A produce crate, he realized. Flimsy, but if he broke it apart he could use one of the slats as a makeshift dagger, poke its eye out, and maybe it would go elsewhere for its next meal. Abruptly, the dumpster eased back and bumped into the brick wall. Long seconds passed before Shelley realized the claws were gone. One moment they'd been pressed against the steel, the next they were absent. He waited a minute, motionless, listening intently for any sound. Gradually he became aware of the ambient noise of the night, the rumble of passing trucks, the hiss of tires on asphalt, the toot of distant horns, his own ragged breathing. He rolled onto his hands and knees and reached for the edge of the dumpster, slowly pulling himself up out of the garbage, his head rising above the surface like a periscope in enemy waters. He peered along the length of the alley left and right. Nothing. As if the lizard had dropped off the face of the earth. I'll be damned. This town is so lame. 18-year-old Stephen Bullinger drained his second can of beer, crumpled the empty aluminium can, and tossed it into one of the decorative bushes that ringed the tarnished bronze statues of Charles Clayton and Jeremiah Falls at the centre of Founders Park. Tony LaCosta shook his head. You say that every night. Yeah, Bullinger, Lucy Quinn said. You need new material. She stood between them, facing the opposite direction, hands stuffed into the pockets of her hoodie, which was hot pink and densely patterned with tiny black skulls would wear. She was the lookout. The bronze 19th century pioneers were depicted astride their horses, angled away from each other in a V-shape, illuminated by recessed floodlights. Clayton pointed into the distance, possibly indicating the site of the present municipal building, while Falls pulled up his horse's reins. But the three teens did not choose their loitering spot out of any sense of civic pride. The benches directly behind the bronze horses were obstructed from view and cloaked in shadow at night, beyond the harsh glare of the monument's floodlights. Stephen grumbled. Making sure you're paying attention. You could leave. Thinking about it, Steve said suddenly, weighing my options. Right, Tony said. Toss me a beer before you drink them all. Stephen slipped his hand into the open backpack he'd set on the park bench next to him and tossed a can to Tony. He looked at Lucy. You want one? She shook her head. I'm good. Drinking was the furthest thing from her mind. You don't drink no more, is that it? No, she said defensively. It's not that. Worried your dad will catch you? Stephen persisted. No, she said, then sighed. Maybe. He is the chief of police. And you have him wrapped around your finger. She scoffed. I wish. What's the real reason? Tony asked, index finger poised over the tab, waiting to open the can. I don't know, she shrugged. The timing. What, not late enough for you? Stephen asked. Tony heaved an exasperated sigh. She's talking about Teddy, you dumbass. Yesterday was the 1-year anniversary, Lucy said. You guys don't think about the accident? Sure I do, Stephen said defensively. Don't see me driving, do you? Jackass, Lucy said, kicking him in the shin. What the hell? Stephen seemed more upset about dropping his 3rd can of beer than about the kick. He scooped it off the ground just before much had spilled. A thin white mist had rolled across the park grounds, progressing in eddies and swirls. Stephen only gave it a moment's notice. Didn't mean anything by it. So being a jerk comes naturally? More like constant practice, Tony said, smirking. Shut up, Stephen said to him. Then he turned to Lucy. Look, a year ago that's all people talked about. Every time they saw me. Any of us walk into a room or if they pass us on the street. Can't say I miss that. Ever since the factory fire. All I'm saying is, I get to deal with it on my own terms now, without people shoving it in my face all the time. Lucy crossed her arms and glared at him. Excuse me if I don't want to forget about Teddy. I didn't say that. Tony, talk to her. None of us want to forget Teddy, Tony said. He was your boyfriend, but we knew him since grade school, and we were all stupid that night. But dwelling on it? I don't think that's... What's wrong? Cops? Lucy was staring at the statues. Her eyes were wide. Her green irises ringed with white. She pointed. 3. 3 horses? Tony followed her gaze. Stephen twisted round on the bench, looking over his shoulder. Moving within the V created by the horses of Clayton and Falls was another horse, a black stallion. Its hooves clopped on the marble base of the life-size monument, and it snorted as its rider steered it away from the bronze tableau between 2 benches and through a gap in the decorative bushes. It's coming for us, Lucy said. What? Stephen looked from her to Tony. Tony dropped his beer can. What the hell? The rider was clad in black, a riding cloak, shirt, trousers and boots. But the first thing Lucy noticed was his head. Rather, his lack of a head. The cloak was tied around the trunk of his neck, but the neck ended in a ragged, bloody stump. No head. And yet she had the feeling he could see everything. He seemed to be staring right at her through invisible eyes. The rider held the horse's reins bunched in his left hand because his right hand held a gleaming sword. Run! Tony yelled. Lucy was paralysed. In that moment she was sure she would have stood still as the headless horseman shoved the sword right through her heart, but Tony grabbed one of her suddenly clammy hands and tugged her sideways. She stumbled after him, looking back, unable to take her eyes off the nightmarish apparition that had materialised out of thin air. Stephen trailed behind them, mainly because he had paused to grab his beer-filled backpack. The horse whinnied and reared up on its hind legs. The rider kicked spurs into the horse's flanks, and it dropped down to all fours and galloped after them, its hooves pounding the earth with deadly determination. Lucy could feel the vibration in her shins and thought she would throw up any second. She realised she was sobbing. Stephen hadn't paused to zip up his backpack. Every few strides a beer can slipped free and stumbled to the ground, letting out a protesting hiss of pressurised foam. Finally he cursed and tossed the backpack aside. Lucy couldn't help glancing back every other step. She stumbled again and again, but Tony's momentum kept her upright. She saw the horseman bear down on Stephen and swing his sword in a whistling arc, determined to reduce the young man to his own headless condition, or perhaps remedy his cranial loss by random substitution. Lucy gave an involuntary shriek. The gleaming blade missed Stephen's neck by a whisker. Stephen must have felt its swift passage. He clapped a hand to the nape of his neck, as if checking for blood. They were near the edge of the park, within sight of the municipal building, when Lucy was jerked to the side. She stumbled and fell against Tony for a moment before he led her to the right. "What?" she began. "We need to split up," Tony said, his breathing ragged. "Can't chase all of us." "But Steve!" The vibration in her legs was gone. She glanced back, but could no longer see the headless horseman. In his grey sweatshirt and faded jeans, Stephen was a blur of motion, running and stumbling towards Park Lane. "Come on," Tony said, pulling her attention back. "Think we lost him." "What was that?" Sure as hell wasn't the neighbourhood watch. Stephen had never run so fast in his life. At some point, between tossing aside the backpack he'd used to smuggle beer out of the house and feeling the horseman's sword whistle past his neck, he forgot about everything that had led up to the nightmarish chase. He stopped questioning the impossibility of a man without a head riding a horse that had appeared out of nowhere. Every iota of his concentration focused on racing from his imminent death, while suppressing the powerful urge to vomit up every last ounce of beer he had imbibed. A single hesitation, for whatever reason, would mean the difference between life and death. Even so, a man, even a sober man, couldn't outrun a horse for long. Stephen veered close to tree trunks, favouring those with low-hanging limbs. Unseat the horseman and the chase turned in his favour. But it seemed he couldn't shake the headless rider, only postpone the inevitable. The thunderous rumble of hooves was never more than one full step away. Face contorted in a rictus of pain, he burst from the edge of the park, bounded across the wide sidewalk and sprinted onto Park Lane. Several steps into his panicked flight across the blacktop, he stumbled and almost fell to his knees. Doubled over, he cringed, waiting for the hard steel to bite into his flesh. Then it occurred to him that the thundering noise of hooves had stopped. He looked back and saw that the headless horseman had vanished. He had never followed Stephen out of the park. Stephen straightened and peered behind him. Nothing moving between the trees. No horse, no headless rider. Looking left and right, he couldn't see Tony or Lucy. Vaguely, he recalled them veering to the side, away from his mindless straight-line flight. Sensible strategy. But he would have had their back. What would he? Staring back at the park, he wondered if the horseman was confined within its boundaries. If his friends remained in the park now, were they in danger? Would the rider seek them out after his solo target had escaped? Steve could go back and warn them, but he had no idea where they had gone. Was Horseman even real? Could they have imagined the whole thing? When he really thought about it, it made no sense. How could it, unless something in the beer? Product tampering? LSD in the cans? No, because Lucy had seen it first and she hadn't had any beer. Then how? Beep! A battered Ford pickup truck swerved round him, the driver leaving behind a string of curses with the truck's pungent white exhaust. Stephen looked down at the painted line and realised that he pulled up in the middle of Park Lane. Fortunately for him, traffic was light in the evening, and the white exhaust was really spreading. Not exhaust. The white, cottony mist he'd barely acknowledged in the park had spread out across the road, swirling around his ankles. An accelerating motor, a deep-throated roar, drew his attention up again, but this vehicle didn't swerve. He had a moment to register the colour red, with a white stripe across the hood leading his eye to the driver, but air exploded out of his lungs as his legs shattered and his body flipped through the air, bounding across the hood of the car, skipping past the windshield and tumbling up and away from the roof as if gravity had suddenly released any claim to his mass. But just as suddenly, it reclaimed him with punishing force, slamming him down onto the blacktop as if swatted from above by a giant hand. His head struck his skull, seemed to lose its rigidity, his vision splitting into two separate views a split second before one side went completely dark and the other began to fade. Somewhere he heard a woman scream. A man looked down at him, shock on his face. "God," Stephen heard him say. Stephen wanted to tell the man not to worry, but the words came out jumbled and seemed to originate far away. It didn't help that he was shivering as he spoke. "Can't believe that guy. He hit you on purpose," the man declared. Stephen tried to shake his head. Big mistake. Pain knifed through him so fiercely he blacked out for a second, maybe longer. When the man's pale face returned, this time with the cell phone pressed to his ear, Stephen tried to explain what he saw before the moment of impact, but only the last two words made it past his numb lips. Nobody driving. What? A young woman stepped into Steve's diminishing field of vision. She grabbed the man's arm. I can't believe it, she said. Her voice sounded distant and hollow. I called an ambulance, the man told her. Tried to get the license plate, she said, glancing briefly at Stephen, long enough for him to see the horror and disbelief on her face before she looked away. Blake, I couldn't. That's okay. It happened so fast. That's not what I mean, she said. Her words were out of sync with her lips, as if she were an actress in a poorly dubbed foreign film. Movement began to leave smears of colour across Stephen's vision. I was looking right at the car, and it vanished. Vanished how? Like the Headless Horseman? Stephen wondered. I don't know, she said. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. Stephen blinked, but when he opened his eyes there was only darkness. He thought they might still be talking above him, but the only sound he heard was a soft, rhythmic thumping, fading and slowing, and then nothing. This was Supernatural. There would then be like supernatural explosion of title. There we go, the prologue. Join me tomorrow for chapter 1 of Supernatural Night Terror.